What you're about to hear about Clark Gable will shatter everything you thought you knew about Hollywood's greatest leading man. The King of Hollywood died in 1960, believing he left no heir behind. But buried in a small Montana town was a truth so explosive. The studios spent millions to keep it hidden. A boy who grew up knowing his father's name but never his father's love. A secret that survived decades of silence, sealed documents, and threats that could destroy careers. Tonight we unlock the vault that Hollywood prayed would stay closed forever. Before we dive deeper into this shocking story, hit that subscribe button, because what you're about to discover about Clark Gable's hidden life will change everything you thought you knew about the golden age of Hollywood. Clark Gable wasn't just an actor, he was an empire. When he smiled on screen, studios made millions. When he spoke, America listened. By 1935, he had already become the highest-paid star in Hollywood, the man every woman wanted and every man wanted to be. His image was untouchable. The studio had built him into something beyond human, a god wrapped in a tuxedo, lighting cigarettes with the kind of confidence that made hearts stop. But gods aren't supposed to make mistakes. And in the spring of 1935, Clark Gable made one that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Her name was Loretta Young. She was 22, radiant, and deeply Catholic. He was 34, married, and reckless. They were filming The Call of the Wild in Washington state. Far from the watchful eyes of MGM executives, far from the gossip columns, far from anyone who could stop what was about to happen. The mountains were cold that spring, but the nights on set were warm. Too warm. Gable had a reputation. Everyone knew it. He drank, he charmed, he conquered. Loretta was different. She didn't drink. She didn't party. She believed in marriage, in virtue, in the kind of old-fashioned values that made her America's sweetheart. But something happened in those mountains. Maybe it was the isolation. Maybe it was the way Gable looked at her between takes, like she was the only woman in the world. Maybe it was the way he whispered her name when the cameras stopped rolling. His voice low and dangerous and impossible to resist. Whatever it was, Loretta Young fell, and Clark Gable caught her. For weeks, they kept it secret. Stolen moments between scenes, midnight walks under stars that saw everything but said nothing. The crew knew something was happening, but no one dared speak. You didn't cross Clark Gable, and you certainly didn't destroy Loretta Young's carefully crafted image. Then filming wrapped. They returned to Los Angeles. He went back to his wife. She went back to her prayers. And for a few months it seemed like the whole thing had been nothing more than a mountain fever dream. Something that happened in another world and stayed there. But by late summer, Loretta knew. Her body was changing. The morning sickness came first, then the weight, then the terrifying realization that she couldn't hide this much longer. She told no one. Not her mother. Not her sisters. Not even her priest. Because in 1935, an unwed Catholic movie star, pregnant with a married man's child, wasn't just a scandal, it was career suicide. It was eternal damnation wrapped in a tabloid headline. So Loretta did what desperate women do. She disappeared. In November 1935, Loretta Young announced she was taking a break from Hollywood. Exhaustion, the studio said. She needed rest, fresh air, time away from the cameras. The press accepted it. America wished her well, and Loretta boarded a train heading north toward a place where no one knew her face. She found a small house outside of Los Angeles, tucked away in the hills where reporters didn't go. She wore scarves over her hair, sunglasses even on cloudy days, loose dresses that hid what was growing inside her. A private doctor visited twice a week, paid in cash, sworn to silence. Clark Gable never came. Not once. She wrote him letters, begging him to acknowledge what they had done, to help her, to at least say something. He never replied. His studio had already made it clear. If this story got out, they would destroy her, and if she tried to name him, they would make sure no one believed her. So Loretta waited, alone. Terrified, praying to a God she wasn't sure was listening anymore. On November 6, 1935, In a small rented house with only a nurse and a doctor present, Loretta Young gave birth to a baby girl. She had Clark Gable's eyes, that unmistakable strong jawline, the same thick dark hair. Anyone who looked at her would know. And that was the problem. Loretta held her daughter for exactly 3 hours. Then the studio's fixer arrived. A woman in a dark coat with a manila envelope full of papers, legal documents, adoption forms, a plan that had been carefully constructed to erase any trace of what had just happened. The baby was taken to an orphanage. Not just any orphanage, but one run by the Catholic Church, where silence was sacred and records could be adjusted. Loretta returned to Hollywood 2 months later, thinner, quieter, but ready to work. She told reporters she felt refreshed, renewed, ready for her next picture. And America believed her, because America always believed its stars. But Loretta couldn't let go. Not completely. 19 months later, she did something that shocked even the studio executives who thought they had seen everything. She adopted 2 children from that same orphanage. A boy and a girl. The girl's name was Judy. It was her daughter, her biological daughter. But no one could ever know. Loretta raised Judy as her adopted child, never once admitting the truth. She hired tutors who kept the girl away from public schools. She controlled every photograph, every interview, every moment of Judy's life. When people commented on how much Judy looked like Loretta, she smiled and called it a blessing from God. Judy grew up knowing something was wrong. Children always know. The way her mother looked at her wasn't like love. It was guilt wrapped in control. Loretta was strict, obsessive, paranoid. She watched Judy's every move, terrified that one day someone would notice the resemblance and start asking questions. And what about Clark Gable? He never acknowledged the girl, never sent money, never asked how she was doing. To him, Loretta Young was just another woman from another film, another mountain, another mistake he had walked away from, without looking back. But the universe has a way of making men pay for the things they bury. In 1942, Gable's wife, Carol Lombard, died in a plane crash. He was devastated, destroyed. For months, he couldn't work, couldn't eat, couldn't do anything but sit in his empty mansion and stare at the walls. Friends said he was haunted, that he kept muttering about things he should have done differently, people he should have been kinder to. Some say he thought about Loretta during those dark months, about the letters she sent that he never answered, about a child he had abandoned before she even took her first breath. But if he felt guilt, he never acted on it. He married again, then again. He lived his life as if that spring in the mountains had never happened. Judy, meanwhile, grew up in a gilded cage. She knew Loretta was her mother. Deep down she always knew, but she didn't know who her father was. Loretta refused to tell her. Even when Judy begged, even when she cried, even when she threatened to go to the press, Loretta stayed silent. Loretta once told her that some secrets were bigger than the people keeping them. Judy spent her teenage years staring at old Hollywood magazines, studying the faces of leading men from the 1930s, trying to find her own features reflected back. She saw herself in Cary Grant's smile, in Gary Cooper's eyes, in Clark Gable's strong, unmistakable jaw. But she never said it out loud. Not yet. Because in Hollywood some truths were too dangerous to speak. The real shock came when Judy turned 23. She was sitting in Loretta's living room, flipping through an old photo album when she found it. A small black and white photograph, tucked between the pages, almost hidden. It showed a young woman standing next to Clark Gable on a mountain film set. The woman was Loretta, and she was looking at Gable the way no one looks at a coworker. Judy stared at that photo for an hour. Then she looked in the mirror. The eyes, the jawline, the ears that stuck out just slightly. It was all there. Clark Gable was her father. She confronted Loretta that night. There was no screaming, no crying, just silence. Loretta sat in her chair, hands folded, and finally nodded. Yes, it was true. Yes, Clark Gable was her father. No, he never wanted to know her. No, she could never tell anyone. Judy asked why. Why keep it secret? Why live this lie for so long? Loretta's answer was simple. Because the studio would destroy them both if the truth came out. Because America wasn't ready to accept that their Catholic sweetheart had a child out of wedlock with a married man. Because some prices were too high to pay, even for the truth. But here's where the story takes its darkest turn. Judy wasn't the only child. There was another, a boy, born not in Los Angeles, but in a small town in Montana, far from Hollywood's reach. His mother was a makeup artist who worked on several of Gable's films in the late 1930s. Her name was Louise, and unlike Loretta, she had no power, no fame, no studio protection. When Louise discovered she was pregnant, she made the mistake of telling Clark Gable directly. She thought he would help her. She thought he was the gentleman he played on screen. She was wrong. Gable's response was cold and calculated. He sent his lawyer with an envelope full of cash and a single instruction: disappear. Have the baby far away from California, never mention his name. If she refused, the studio would make sure she never worked again. They would ruin her reputation, destroy her family, and ensure that no one would ever believe her story. Louise took the money. She moved to Montana, to a small town where no one knew Hollywood and no one cared about movie stars. She gave birth to a boy in 1939 and named him Thomas. She never told him who his father was, not directly. But every night before bed she would look at him with tears in her eyes and whisper that his father was a king. Thomas grew up poor. His mother worked as a seamstress, taking in mending and alterations to keep food on the table. They lived in a tiny house at the edge of town, the kind of place where winter winds cut through the walls and summer heat made sleep impossible. But Louise never complained. She raised her son with love, with pride, and with a secret she carried until the day she died. Thomas knew he was different. Kids at school mocked him for not having a father. Teachers looked at him with pity, but his mother always told him the same thing. He came from greatness. He had a strength inside him that others couldn't see, and one day he would understand. In 1960, Clark Gable died of a heart attack. The world mourned. Hollywood dimmed its lights. America lost its king. And in a small Montana town, Louise sat her 21-year-old son down and told him the truth. His father was Clark Gable, the king of Hollywood. The man whose face was on every magazine, whose voice filled every theater, whose legend would live forever, and he had never once acknowledged his son's existence. Thomas didn't believe her at first. It seemed impossible. Why would a man like Clark Gable abandon a child? Why would he walk away without ever looking back? But Louise showed him the evidence. The cash payments that came every few months, always from a Los Angeles law firm, always without explanation. The letters she had written to Gable over the years begging him to at least meet his son, letters that were returned unopened. And most damning of all, a single photograph taken on a film set in 1938 showing Louise standing next to Clark Gable, his hand resting on her shoulder, his smile warm and familiar. Thomas stared at that photograph for days. He saw his own face reflected in Gable's features, the broad shoulders, the deep-set eyes, the way they both tilted their heads when they smiled. It was undeniable. But what could he do? Clark Gable was dead. There would be no confrontation, no reconciliation, no moment where father and son could finally meet. The door had closed forever. Or so he thought. In 1961, Thomas decided to go public. He contacted newspapers, wrote letters to Hollywood studios, reached out to anyone who would listen. He claimed to be Clark Gable's biological son and demanded recognition, not money, not fame, just acknowledgement. He wanted the world to know that Clark Gable had abandoned a child and lived his entire life pretending that child didn't exist. The response was swift and brutal. Gable's estate denied everything. Studio lawyers called Thomas a fraud, a con artist, a desperate nobody trying to profit from a dead man's legacy. They threatened lawsuits, criminal charges, public humiliation. They made it clear that if Thomas continued, they would destroy him. And they did. Thomas lost his job. His reputation was shredded. Newspapers painted him as a liar, a fantasist, a man so desperate for attention that he would invent a connection to Hollywood royalty. His mother was harassed, their home was vandalized, and within a year, Thomas gave up. He moved deeper into Montana, changed his name, and disappeared from public view. He spent the rest of his life working odd jobs, drifting from town to town, carrying a secret that no one would ever believe. But the truth doesn't stay buried forever. In 1994, Judy Lewis, the daughter Loretta Young, had finally published her memoir. In it she confirmed that Clark Gable was her biological father. She described the years of secrecy, the shame, the control. She exposed the machinery that Hollywood used to bury scandals and protect its stars. And for the first time, the world believed. DNA testing had advanced by then. Journalists began investigating Clark Gable's hidden past. And slowly, piece by piece, other stories began to surface. Stories of women paid to stay silent. Stories of children born in secret and erased from history. Stories of a man who played heroes on screen but lived as a coward behind it. Thomas saw Judy's story on television. He was 55 years old, gray-haired, worn down by decades of silence. He reached out to her through a lawyer. He sent copies of the letters his mother had kept. He offered to take a DNA test if any of Gable's biological materials still existed. Judy believed him. She had lived the same lie, carried the same shame, felt the same abandonment. She knew what it was like to grow up as the child Clark Gable refused to acknowledge. But by then, it was too late for justice. Clark Gable's estate was closed. The legal battles were over, and most of Hollywood had moved on. Thomas's story was mentioned in a few articles, acknowledged by a few historians but never given the weight it deserved. Thomas died in 2003. He was buried in a small Montana cemetery, far from Hollywood, far from fame, far from the father who never knew him. On his headstone, his family engraved a single line, "Son of a King." It was the closest Thomas ever came to being recognized. And what about Judy? She spent her final years speaking out about the darkness behind Hollywood's golden age. She talked about the studio system that controlled women's bodies, the fixers who erased scandals, the powerful men who walked away from their mistakes without consequence. She died in 2011, having finally told her truth. But there's one more twist to this story. One final secret that didn't emerge until years after both Judy and Thomas were gone. In 2015, a researcher going through old MGM archives discovered something strange. A sealed file labeled Clark Gable, confidential, do not open. Inside were documents detailing payments made by the studio to multiple women over a span of 2 decades. Payments for silence, payments for abortions, payments for children sent away to orphanages or distant towns. There were at least 4 other women, 4 other potential children, names and dates carefully recorded, then locked away. Clark Gable didn't just abandon Judy and Thomas. He left behind an entire hidden family. Children who never knew their father. Siblings who never knew each other. A legacy of secrecy and shame that stretched across decades. And the studios knew. They always knew. They covered it up, buried the evidence, paid off the mothers, and threatened anyone who dared to speak. Because protecting Clark Gable's image was worth more than the truth, worth more than the lives of the women he used and discarded, worth more than the children who grew up wondering why they weren't enough. That's the real story of Clark Gable. Not the king Hollywood crowned, but the man they hid. A man who smiled for the cameras and walked away from his own blood. A man who lived as a legend and died as a lie. So when you see his face on old movie posters, when you hear his voice in those classic films, remember this. Behind every smile was a secret. Behind every romance was a woman left behind. And behind the king of Hollywood was a trail of children he never had the courage to claim. Thomas never got to meet his father. Judy spent decades living a lie. And somewhere out there, other children of Clark Gable may still exist, carrying his DNA, his features, his legacy, but never his name. That's the price of being a king In a kingdom built on lies, you get the crown, you get the glory, but you lose everything that makes you human. And in the end, the only thing left is the legend. Cold, untouchable, and utterly hollow. Clark Gable died, believing he had no children. But the truth is, he had many. He just didn't have the heart to love them.